A woman pressed her palm against a limestone wall in the dark and held it there, steady, while someone behind her sprayed red ochre from a hollowed reed. When she pulled her hand away, the wall remembered her. The print is still there. You can stand in that cave today and put your own hand beside it. She did this in what is now Indonesia. She did this nearly 68,000 years ago. That is older than any other surviving piece of human art on Earth. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because everything we think we know about where humanity's story really begins, the cave paintings of France, the carvings of Spain, the Great Awakening of art in Ice Age Europe, all of it happens long after this woman pressed her hand to a wall on a small Indonesian island. She was already there. She was already an artist. And her people had already been living among those islands for so long that we are only now starting to understand what they were, where they came from, and what they left behind in the bones, the blood, and the DNA of the people who live on those same islands today. When scientists finally looked at that DNA, the story did not make sense. It still does not. Completely. There are over 17,000 islands in the Indonesian archipelago. More than 700 languages are still spoken across them. Imagine a country the length of mainland Europe, a country you cross by ocean, not by road, where the language of the village you grew up in might be unintelligible to a village 2 islands over. That is Indonesia. That is the canvas this story is painted on. And the canvas is older than almost anywhere on Earth where anatomically modern humans were doing what we recognize as fully human things. Painting, storytelling, mourning, imagining beings that don't exist. Inside another Sulawesi cave, archaeologists found a scene. 3 small figures, part human and part animal, surrounding a wild pig with a spear. It is at least 51,000 years old. It is the earliest known story ever told in pictures, not a record of something seen. A scene, an imagined moment. The people who painted that, were they our direct ancestors? Were they the same people whose great-great-grandchildren walk Jakarta today, drive scooters through Yogyakarta, weave songket in Sumatra, plant rice in the Balinese terraces? That is the question. And the answer is one of the strangest in human genetics. Because the people who painted that pig were probably not the direct ancestors of the people who live there now. The DNA tells a different story. Travel just a few miles east of Bali, by ferry, to the island of Lombok. You can see Bali from the Lombok beach. The water between them is narrow, but it is deep, extraordinarily, treacherously deep. And on the other side, something strange happens. The animals change. The plants change. The Asian elephants, tigers, and rhinos that once roamed Java are gone. In their place, you find marsupials, parrots, cockatoos, creatures whose closest cousins live in Australia and New Guinea. This is the Wallace Line. It was first mapped in 1863 by a British naturalist crossing those exact waters. He could not explain it then. But standing on Lombok, looking back at Bali, he understood he was looking at the edge of 2 different worlds, 2 different evolutionary worlds, 2 different families of life. And here is the part that took genetics over 100 years to confirm. The same line runs through human beings. Walk west of that line, on Java or Sumatra or Borneo, and the DNA of the people you meet tells one story. Walk east, into Sulawesi, into the Moluccas, into Flores and Timor and West Papua, and the DNA tells a completely different story. Almost as if the same invisible wall that kept the tigers from crossing kept the people from mixing too. For decades, nobody could explain it. Now, we can. And the explanation reaches deeper into the past than anyone expected. The first chapter is the oldest. Around 50,000 years ago, maybe earlier, small bands of anatomically modern humans were already moving down through what is now Asia and crossing into the islands. They were the painters. They were the people who left those handprints. They were headed somewhere even further, into what would become Australia and New Guinea. Many passed through. Some stayed. And while they were island hopping toward the south, they ran into someone else. Not someone like them. Someone older. For most of human history, we did not even know these people existed. They left almost no fossils. We have a finger bone from a cave in Siberia, a few teeth, a jaw from Tibet. That is essentially all of them. We call them Denisovans. They were a sister species to the Neanderthals. They split from our lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. And then, somewhere on those Indonesian islands, our ancestors met them. And our ancestors had children with them. You can still find that meeting in the blood. If you sequence the genome of a person from West Papua today, you find that as much as 1/20th of their DNA, 1 part in 20, does not come from Homo sapiens. It comes from Denisovans. It is the highest proportion of an extinct cousin species in any humans alive on Earth. Think about that for a moment. The people of West Papua are walking around with another kind of human inside them. A kind we cannot picture because we have never found a complete skeleton, a kind we know mostly through them. And when researchers looked closer, the story got stranger. They found that the Denisovan DNA in Papuans comes in not one signal, but at least 2, meaning this did not happen once. 2 different Denisovan populations met our ancestors, met them in different places at different times, and left their genetic fingerprints in slightly different patterns. There were several waves of contact, several encounters, several quiet moments when 2 kinds of human looked at each other and chose, somehow, to stay. And here is the detail that I keep coming back to. The Denisovans must have crossed the Wallace Line themselves. That deep water, that hard biogeographic boundary that stopped elephants and tigers, was crossed somehow by a hominin species so ancient that they predate us. They got onto boats, or rafts, or floating mats of vegetation. We do not know how. We only know that they did, because their DNA is found only on the eastern side of that line, in the people whose ancestors went on to populate Australia and Oceania. They were sea crossers, hundreds of thousands of years ago. We will probably never know what they looked like. We may never find their full skeleton. But every person of Papuan ancestry today is, in a small but real sense, partly them. The Denisovans did not entirely die out. They live on, distributed across millions of people, scattered through a few % of every cell. That alone would be enough to make Indonesia one of the most extraordinary places in the human story. But it gets deeper, because somewhere on the island of Flores, in a limestone cave called Liang Bua, something else was living. In 2003, archaeologists pulled out the skeleton of a small adult woman, about 3.5 feet tall, small brain, long arms, heavy shoulders. She was not a child. She was not deformed. She was a different species entirely. Homo floresiensis. The world started calling them the hobbits. They had been on that island for hundreds of thousands of years, isolated, shrinking, evolving into something that looked nothing like us. They made tools. They used fire. They hunted miniature elephants that lived on the island and avoided giant rats and Komodo dragons. They survived there until something like 50,000 years ago, which is to say, they were still alive when modern humans first reached Flores. For years, the most haunting idea was that today's small-statured people of Flores, the Rampasasa, might carry some of their DNA. That the hobbits and our ancestors had met and mingled and left some trace. When the test was finally done, the result was a quiet, definitive no. The Rampasasa are not their descendants. They evolved their stature separately, much more recently on the same island. The hobbits, whoever they truly were, left no children among us. They simply stopped. Around the same time, our ancestors arrived. It is hard not to feel something when you say that out loud. A whole branch of the human family that survived for hundreds of thousands of years on one island, in one cave, hunting tiny elephants in the dark, gone. And the people now living on that island knew nothing about them until a Western archaeologist's brush, in this century, found a small skull in the dirt. Indonesia is full of these stories. That is what makes it the place it is. If you've ever felt the pull of this kind of story, the lost branches, the quiet erasures, the deep ancestral chapters most of human history forgot, that's what this whole journey has been about for me. There are more of these to come. Because there is one more wave, and it is the wave that explains why your friend from Jakarta and your friend from Papua might have such different faces, such different languages, such different ancient stories, and still call themselves Indonesian. Around 4,000 years ago, far to the north, in what is now Taiwan, a seafaring people began to move. They had developed something extraordinary: boats that could cross open ocean, outrigger canoes, sails, a way of reading stars and currents that allowed them to leap from one island to another across distances that had been uncrossable. They are called the Austronesians, and what they did over the next few thousand years is one of the largest human migrations in history. From Taiwan, they spread south into the Philippines, into Borneo, into Java, into Sumatra. They kept going. They reached Madagascar, off the coast of Africa. They reached Easter Island, in the middle of the Pacific. They reached Hawaii. They reached New Zealand. They are the reason that someone in Madagascar and someone in Hawaii speak languages that, deep down, share the same grandparent. And when they arrived in Indonesia, they did not arrive in an empty place. They mixed with the people who were already there, the descendants of the painters, the descendants of those who had met Denisovans. They brought new genes. They brought new languages. They brought rice farming. They reshaped almost everything. In Western Indonesia, this Austronesian story is the dominant one. The people of Mentawai and Nias, two small islands off Sumatra, clustered genetically with the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, half a sea away, 5,000 years apart. The connection is still there in the blood. But in the East, the story is messier. And here is where the most recent science changes everything. In 2024, an Indonesian geneticist named Gludhug Purnomo, working with colleagues in Australia, published the largest ever genetic study of the people of eastern Indonesia, 254 genomes, from communities that had never been included in a major genetic survey before, the kind of people you do not read about in any history book. What he found shook the field. Everyone had assumed that the deep Papuan-related ancestry in eastern Indonesia was a relic, something inherited directly from those first migrants 50,000 years ago who passed through on their way to Australia. The DNA of the painters, the DNA of those who met Denisovans. But the data said something else. Most of that Papuan-related ancestry in eastern Indonesia is recent. It arrived in the last 3,500 years, in a separate wave from West Papua. The first migrants did not vanish, but their genetic signal had been almost entirely overwritten by people moving in much later. Read that sentence again, because it carries the weight of 50,000 years. The people who painted those caves, the people whose ancestors met the Denisovans, the people who got here first, when most of humanity outside Africa had not even left their homelands yet, their direct genetic trace in modern people is faint, almost gone. Their story survived in the rock paintings, the stone tools, and a few haunting fragments of DNA. But the people on top of them, the people who came later and built on what they made, are mostly newer arrivals. And yet, the painters did not entirely disappear. The deepest layer of every Indonesian, and they really do mean every Indonesian, still carries something old. A signature so ancient that it predates the Austronesian wave. Older than the Papuan wave. Older than anything written in any human document. It traces back, in fragments, to those first people who pressed their hands against the cave walls and watched the red ochre dry. You cannot scrub 50,000 years out of a population. Even when wave after wave moves through, something remains. This is what makes Indonesia, genetically, one of the strangest and most beautiful places on Earth. Almost every other country can tell you a relatively simple origin story. The English are this and that mixed together. The Japanese came from here, with a little from there. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Persians, countries old and proud, but their genetic stories are simpler. Indonesia is not simple. Indonesia is a layer cake of every major human chapter that ever happened in this corner of the world. The first artists, the first sea crossers, the first known meeting place between us and the Denisovans, the home of a lost species of small humans whose name we did not know a generation ago, the destination of a Neolithic migration that reshaped half a hemisphere, the crossroads of trade winds, religions, empires. All of that, every wave, every encounter, every painter and every voyager is folded inside the person sitting next to you on a flight from Jakarta, or driving you through the rice terraces of Bali, or selling you ikat cloth in a Flores market. They do not always know this story. Most of it has only emerged in the last 20 years, and most of it has emerged from the work of Indonesian researchers themselves, like Purnomo, finally being able to sequence the genomes of their own communities and recover what was always there. There are still mysteries. We still do not know exactly when the first humans reached the islands. The rock art keeps getting older every time someone tests a new layer of mineral crust above it. Some paintings may yet turn out to be older still. We do not know who exactly painted them, whether their direct descendants are still on Sulawesi today, or whether they were a different population entirely. We do not know where the Denisovans came from, or how they crossed the Wallace Line, or whether somewhere in the deep jungle interior of these islands we might one day find a tooth, a bone, a fragment that finally shows us their face. And we do not know what stories the hobbits told themselves around their small fires in the years before our ancestors arrived. It is genuinely possible that some of what we will learn from Indonesia over the next decade will rewrite the human family tree again. I will leave you with the woman at the cave wall. She was real. She lived. She pressed her palm against the limestone and felt the cold of it and did not know, could not have known, that someone in another universe, someone like you, separated from her by more time than civilization has existed many times over, would one day stand where she stood and put their own hand beside hers. She did not know that 50,000 years later, scientists would extract DNA from people living a few miles from her cave and read in it the genetic ghost of a species she had never met. She did not know that the same boats that carried her descendants would one day reach Easter Island and Madagascar and Hawaii. She did not know that the cousin species hiding in the next valley over would survive after her own people were gone, and would themselves disappear before our ancestors fully understood what they had lost. She only knew the ochre on her palm, and the wall, and someone behind her, holding the reed, ready to spray. That handprint is the beginning of a story. It is not anyone's story exclusively, it is everyone's.